That's going to be a great intro to this very serious discussion.
Hello and welcome to Storyweavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story-related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
And John William Worth.
And this is Storyweavers. All right, welcome back to this episode of Storyweavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story-related. Today is going to be a little bit of a different format than what we've done up until now. This is going to be a two-part episode, and basically what we did was John and I traded some form of media. John gave me a graphic art novel, and I gave John a couple albums to listen to. And neither of us were terribly familiar with either when we were given them, but we've both taken a little bit of time to ingest them, get to know them a little bit, and now we're going to be here and talk about them, get each other's reactions, and then also give each of us a chance to kind of talk about a piece of art that we're both very passionate about, and that's affected each of us, in our own ways. So hopefully you enjoy it. Again, this will be a two-part episode, and this first part, we are going to be talking about the graphic novel that John had me read, which was... John?
The Crow by James O'Barr. So I guess I'll just discuss my history with The Crow and what it's about, and then why I decided for you to read it.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Basically, The Crow it's the graphic novel and the film version, and many of its somewhat inferior sequels. They all follow the same premise: is that a tragedy strikes usually a couple, man and a woman. In this case, it's Eric Draven and his fiancée, Shelley. I believe I said the last name correctly. It's Draven.
Draven,
he's in a rock band. And they are assaulted and then brutally murdered by a gang. And then 1 year later, I believe it's on Halloween, a crow brings Eric's soul back in order to seek revenge on those who killed him and his fiancée.
Basically, reanimates his dead corpse, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, because one of the things that a lot of people get wrong is they think crows are like the harbingers of doom. That's actually ravens, hence the raven. Crows are the birds that carry your souls to the afterlife. They're like the deliverers. Yep. And that's why, like, in the comic as well as the movie, there's a crow that follows Eric everywhere. And that's his soul. That's why, like,
that was one of the things I was going to ask you, was the symbolism of the crow.
Yeah. That's why, because it carries his soul, and that's why. I mean, I won't go into spoilers, but at some point they talk to like a spiritual woman, and she says the crow is the key to that man. If you kill the crow, you kill the man.
Interesting.
So the comic follows the same plot as the film. I mean, vice versa, because it's based on the comic.
Film's based on the comic. Comic came first.
Yep, it was written by a man named James O'Barr. It was an underground comic first, and I believe it was published in installments, like most graphic novels are. So it wasn't in like one of the big publishers like DC. It might have been in like Vertigo, maybe, but I'm not familiar with who. And you could kind of see it. You could see like the chapters, how it's divided up.
Yeah.
And it's drawn in a very, very stark black and white style. There's some part that's what attracts me to graphic novels, like particular ones, besides their story or their legacy, like Watchmen or V for Vendetta or Sin City, for example. That was the graphic novel series that got me into graphic novels back in high school.
Yeah, that was the first graphic novel adaption I think I saw.
It was the movie adaptation that attracted me to the comics because it was literally like a comic brought to life.
Mm-hmm.
So Sin City was what I looked at, but I actually came across The Crow. I came across the film first, as I feel like most people do, because it's a legendary film for good and tragic reasons, which I'll get into in a moment.
Yeah.
But I saw the film, and it is very stylistically done. It's directed by a man named Alex Proyas, who went on to direct Dark City, Knowing, and a couple other films that slip my mind at the moment. Very stylish, very well acted, very strong script, very, very accurate to the comic, but it deviates in ways that aren't disrespectful because the comic itself came from a very tragic place because James O'Barr... Yes, it's James O'Barr's fiance was killed in a drunk driving accident, I believe it was. And it came from that's why, like, the comic, another reason it's an underground comic and I can understand it, it's a very, very cynical story. Like, there's hope, but it's very grim hope. Like, these characters are already dead. They're already in depressing situations. And
it's not something you want to read if, like, you're not in a good mood and you want to get into a good mood.
Exactly. But the
you
thing
kind of
is,
have to be
like
in a mindset for it.
There's still that glimmer of hope at the end because I just randomly thought of, I like this quote from Stanley Kubrick concerning the Shining. He's the director of The Shining. And he spoke to Stephen King once, and Stephen King, like, he told Stephen King, I think The Shining is a happy story. And Stephen King, well, color me shocked, you know, why would you call it a happy story? And he said, because if there's ghosts, that means there's something after life, which means that life doesn't end. It's an interesting perspective. And The Crow kind of runs with that, the idea that there is an afterlife and there is a form of compassion from the crow bringing that soul back because of something so tragic happening to it.
And just to interject real quick, this and I think the fact that we picked The Crow and the albums I had you listen to it's going to be a really interesting dichotomy because both of them definitely have kind of like two halves to them, where part of it is vengeance and then the other part of it is redemption, basically.
Yes, which you see with the characters because in the film and in the comic as well, there's a little girl named Sherry, I believe it is, which there's definitely a similarity between the fiance Shelley and Sherry. Sherry's like a little girl whose mom is, I believe, a heroin addict.
Yeah, she's basically an orphan. I mean, it does from the little info we have, her mom doesn't really take
which
care
James
of her
O'Barr, the author himself, was an orphan, something I found out recently. So to say this story is incredibly autobiographical is an understatement.
An understatement, big time.
Yes. It's just so stylishly done, and like the art style. Like I said, when I found it at Barnes and Noble back in high school, I had seen the film and I was like, okay. And then I cracked it open. I was like, oh wow. The only comic I think that I'd ever seen that had that kind of like power with me, like grabbed me with the art style, was Batman Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which is done with like almost like pastel colors, and it's very I almost had you read that one. Yeah. Because I have it on the bookshelf right next to The Crow.
I'll have to check that one out now too.
It's so good. But
the cool thing about oh no, go ahead.
I was gonna say the one other thing that's very notable about The Crow is that I wouldn't say that the idea of it that it's cursed, but the fact that the story came about from such a tragic origin. The film is notable besides being a good film because
I think it gained a lot of notoriety because of the incident.
But it's like Brandon Lee, which I'm sure almost everyone knows at this point, he tragically was killed on set by a blank slug. There was a scene where him and I forget it's one of like the Minion gangsters or Minion gang members.
Yeah.
And there were blanks and they fired it, but I think it was like a real bullet or something went wrong and he was shot. And I believe the actor who played the gang member never acted again. I think he died. Sadly, like the whole movie is just steeped in like this tragedy. And I mean, it's bolstered by the fact that Brandon Lee gave an awesome performance. You know, he is incredible in that movie. And it's just that it's such a heavy film. I think that's what helps lend it even more credence, because otherwise you would say, like, oh, it was an okay comic book movie. But And it was made in 1994, before comic book movies or comic books were taken even somewhat seriously. Even today, they're still
Right.
not to a degree, which we'll probably get into more with the Marvelization episode.
Yeah.
But like, this was one of the first dark comic adaptations, and this was back when comics were still considered exotic to adapt. Like, even something serious like Ghost World was like exotic. Oh, it's a graphic novel. But anyway, getting back to the weighty subject matter, it's, Hey guys, it's John. Just wanted to drop in really quick and just remind everyone that next week we'll be covering this month's book of the month, Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. It's an anti-war novel about a soldier recovering from wounds he received in battle. It's a very famous novel written in 1939. I read it back in high school, and it left a very indelible mark upon me and my art. I'm looking forward to seeing what all of you think of it, and I'm especially looking forward to seeing what Dean thought of it. He mentioned that he was going to watch the movie adaptation, also by Dalton Trumbo, made in 1971, and I'm very interested to see what he thinks of that as well. I haven't seen the film. So, we'll be getting back to the episode, but I just wanted to remind all of you. The whole story is just steeped in tragedy, but there's, like you said, redemption to it. So it's that interesting back and forth between the two.
Well, same thing with me that pulled you in was just the graphic novelization, just the style of art. I haven't read very many graphic novels in my time, but this one in particular, I found myself sometimes getting distracted from the story by just like gazing at the images. Yes. I mean, they're beautiful. I looked it up a little bit, and pretty much everything. I read it off a digital version. I wanted the actual physical copy, but I was traveling and want to have to take it with me. But all of the art, from what I could tell, is completely hand drawn, and it's basically just been just digitized. Like, no additional effects or anything have been done to it. And you look at some of the images and the way he uses shadow and empty space to convey images is really, really interesting.
Yes, it's like the whole
and his perspectives too. Sometimes, when he's showing a scene or something happening, the perspectives he uses, like there's a gunfight in a bar, I think, and there are just some really cool angles, like from behind the bar, or things like that. I thought were really interesting.
I mean, a graphic novel is essentially just stills from a movie, and Alan Moore, who's the author of Watchmen and V for Vendetta, he's very notorious for saying you can't easily take a graphic novel and turn it into a film, because just like you said, with a comic or a graphic novel, you can stop and stare at a frame and you could take in every single detail in it.
And that frame is designed to give you all the information you need for the plot moving forward.
Yes,
including things that might not catch your eye the first time around.
Right. And also it's like how it's stylistically done. Like you might have the panels going diagonally across the page.
Right.
You might have them get smaller and then a big one. It's all very interpretive, and it's just like how in books, like short paragraphs make things choppy. In a film, fast editing or slow editing, it's the same concept here. Yeah, it's just it's like the whole graphic novel itself is steeped in one mission, which is to translate this unbelievable feeling of tragedy into a single image, a single message, and a single story. It's like everything is devoted to that one path.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
So I mean, this goes back to the general question of what did you think of it, and what scene stuck out to you the most for any reason?
Okay. I loved it. Again, like I said, I'm not well versed in graphic novels, but I read it all in one sitting on a plane ride. I fell in love with it, and then like a week later, I reread it. I said the art style is just gorgeous. The story is heart-wrenching, and a second read was definitely beneficial, because the first read, a lot of times you're kind of just trying to figure out like what's going on, who's who. Most of the novel is in black and white, so sometimes it was a little it could be a little difficult to distinguish between certain characters and who was talking sometimes. So a lot of my first read was kind of just like trying to figure it out. But then once I got to the end and had kind of a better understanding of the whole plot, the whole story, and reading it again, that was very, very beneficial. I was able to focus less on the plot and more on kind of like the subtle intricacies that were laid out throughout. As for my favorite scene, the one that sticks with me that I recall is the scene where he meets Shelley, and he gives Shelley
the girl or his fiance,
the little girl,
Sherry,
not Shelley. Yeah, when he meets Sherry, and gives her Shelley's engagement ring. Because it's very sweet and it's very heartfelt, and it's kind of stuck in the middle amongst all of these pages of
just before the finale,
violence, interspersed with, you know, all of his like sub-psychotic rage of being in his house by himself, basically pining for her. And it's just this little moment where you see that, you know, yes, he's vengeful in the fact that he's seeking vengeance on the death of his fiance and himself, but mainly his fiance. You know, they took his love away from him. But we see that he's not just like all out violence, kill everything. It's intentional.
His goal is to make the world a better place.
Right. Yeah. And we see, you know, as much as we see his heart kind of exposed on the other pages, this one we actually see his relationship with a totally new person. It was very touching, and that's and it wasn't even necessarily like the graphics or anything. It was just that part of the story.
Because like you said, he's like a rageful machine through most of it, but then there are these little moments. Even I think this is in the graphic novel, but it's one of my favorite scenes in the film. He meets Sherry's mom, and she had just shot up with a bunch of heroin, and he kills the gang member with her. And then he like grabs her arm, and all the heroin like oozes out of her.
Ooh, I don't think that's not in the graphic novel.
Because he forces Sherry's mom to be like a better mother and to like be there for her. And he says like, mother is God in the eyes of a child. Go be a mother to your child.
I like that.
Sherry's a little different in the movie. In the movie, she's a much more like forward and kind of like a badass character, like a tomboy, and she's a little bit older.
Gotcha.
But it's like you see that, and then like
it's kind of cool if they took that little vignette. I mean, there's a little bit more to her in the
movie,
in the arc. Well, but even in the arc of the graphic novel, there's more than just that one scene, I believe. But the fact that they kind of took it and expanded upon it in the movie in a fitting way, that's pretty cool.
Because again, he's this rageful machine, but you also see he was a person, and it's like his goal isn't to hurt the people who didn't hurt him. He's not a monster,
right?
Even though you could almost compare him to a monster, and seeing the things he does, he is a monster. Like for art reasons, I really like the bar scene, how a lot of it's portrayed in straight up darkness. Like there's part, if I remember right, where the light just goes out and it's all just dialogue. And then like the mercy kill at the end, where I think it's T-Bird. He like kills T-Bird by like overdosing him on heroin. Or something, which is almost in itself is almost like I almost want to say mercy, because T-Bird helped him out a little bit. Which is the opposite of the movie. In the movie, T-Bird has one of my favorite lines where Eric like sends him off a dock into the harbor, and T-Bird's just saying like, abashed the devil stood and saw how awful goodness is. That's the other thing I really like about the comic and the movie. They quote all of these classical things, and it's like so cool. But yeah,
just a lot of fun little references.
Exactly, and it all just fits the mood. Just like one of the scenes like I like is in the comic, how he's going through the rings in the pawn shop, and it's in the movie, but it's not as over the top, like him throwing the rings, going not that one, not that one. It's just like this fun little scene. It's one of the first scenes where you see who he is now, like what he's capable of. But yeah, and I mean, this also leads me to another question. What do you think because obviously the story came from a tragic place. It came from the author's depression. Let's say it. Do you think the story is representative of rage or depression, hope? What would you say?
I mean, it's a little bit of everything. It's very honest, I think. You know, he was I mean, his fiance was killed by a drunk driver, and he obviously, I mean, it seems like, especially the moments where he's in the comic, where he's in the house alone, thinking about her, and it shows like the memories of them together on like Christmas Day or painting a wall. And he just, he missed the little like simple things in life. And I think a lot of those scenes came from a very real place. And like we're going to talk about when we get to my episode, I think a lot of the violence comes from fantasies. You know, when you're in that rage and you're, your mind kind of loses all control, and you fantasize about different ways to hurt this person that did something like this to you, so heinous. And I think a lot of that comes out. And again, like I said, when we talk about what I have to talk about in the next episode, we're going to see a very, very similar theme.
Yep. It's funny.
In the artist kind of taking their rage,
a piece of themselves.
And instead of, going out into the real world and society and taking it out on people, they're basically channeling it, into an art form.
Right.
And basically sharing that pain with others, because they're not the only ones that have been through something like this.
Unfortunately,
and I would
pain
think,
is universal.
Yeah, and you think the hope is that this reaches people who have been in similar situations or have been in situations that have wrought similar feelings, and helps them find some way to cope and find closure and move on.
Because we've all experienced loss, whether hopefully not as much loss like is demonstrated in the graphic novel and in the film.
Unexpected loss.
Right, but everyone has experienced some form of loss, and to see that portrayed honestly, like you said, warts and all,
right.
Which, like you said, the author could have gone out to society and burned down a building. He could have hurt someone, which obviously horrible thing to do. Putting it in a comic like this or an art form, it's like people can look at it and say, I felt the same way.
Right.
Like you just want to lash out. You want to do something to someone. Or it's like, even if you hate yourself, because there's scenes of self-mutilation in the comic. In the movie, they actually cut a lot of the house scenes and the self-reflective scenes out, because obviously with a film, it's not as palatable.
Well, I assume,
and it's not
I haven't seen the film, but I assume the film is more of an action film with some drama interspersed.
Yes.
Instead of being a drama with action.
It's still reflective, but it's a little more like conversational. Like Eric has much more of a relationship with the police chief or the police officer as well. In the comic, it's like
in trying to like track down the gang.
Yeah, or it's like the police officer saying, hey bro, what you're doing is kind of wrong, but it's also, you're an undead spirit, so I can't do much.
Yeah.
I mean,
he does have that kind of a relationship with him in the comic. There are just far fewer scenes of it, I guess.
Yes, but it's like, I had just thought of like a book that has absolutely nothing to do with the Crow called A Monster Calls. I think I mentioned it before. It deals with, it's a children's book that deals with a young boy whose mother is dying of cancer. And the book to me is notable because the mother actually tells her son, like, look, if you want to go break things. If you want to take a baseball bat to a tree, do it, because it's what you feel. And it's like, the ending of the book isn't him saying, I'm going to miss you or anything. It's him saying, I don't want you to go. So it's that brutal kind of honesty that relates A Monster Calls to The Crow with me. It's just, The Crow is a much more violent and dark and visceral, but it's that same kind of emotion where it's like, yes, you are going to feel things that people are going to say you shouldn't, that's dangerous, that's bad, but we've all felt them, and unfortunately we will all feel them at some point. So it's not like a blueprint, but it's more like someone kind of like saying, look here, you will get through it. So,
Now, I have a question for you. So you discovered The Crow when you were in high school,
Yeah, about
and
then,
you've
yes.
probably seen the movie and read the comic multiple times over the past 10 to 15 years.
Not in totality, but I always go back to it and I read certain parts over and I just admire the artwork too.
So
So
is there anything about your perception of it that has changed over time, um, in general, or in regards to how you view it?
So one of the things that I actually experienced this with a lot of literature and a lot of stuff that I saw or read or experienced first when I was younger. And I always
Mhm.
kind of, again, a wonderful analogy. I always go to The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
Read it first in high school, and it's like, oh, it's a cool story, but I didn't relate. Now that I'm an
Yeah.
adult, I see it for like he wants the girl, and he's
Mhm.
trying to be that. And you
You're
also
able to
start
read
seeing
in between the lines and see the
exactly, and it's like
subtleties.
and that's one of the things our teacher in high school said about the book was that it's almost bad that you read it now. You should
Mhm.
read it when you're older, just
'Cause
like
you'll
what people
appreciate
say
it so much
about
more.
Catcher in the Rye. Don't read it when you're
Right.
an
Oh,
adult.
no. I would
Read it
have
when you're a
hated Catcher in the
teenager.
Rye 15 years ago.
I think
Would
I
have
think
hated it.
I read I read Catcher in the Rye when I was like in my early 20s, and I still enjoyed it because I was
Mhm.
close to that age, but I saw like what they meant. Like I would have loved this when I was a
Yeah.
teenager
I
because I
read it
could
last
relate.
year.
Right. But it's like it's the same thing with The Crow. When I saw it in high school, it was the art style, it was cool, it was
Mhm.
badass, and it's like I
It
was
was
still
violent. It was,
I was at the
there's
age
all
where
that.
a lot of the themes, a lot of the feelings, like how we talk about rage, we talk about anger, and particularly loss. As a teenager or someone in your early 20s, one, you think you're invincible, and two, you
Mhm.
some people have experienced it by
Mhm.
then. But as a teenager, you don't really experience it, or it's like you feel
And
kind of like this imperviousness to it.
you don't really have the ability to cope with it almost as much. Like, I feel like I'm at a point now, and it took me into my 30s to get to a point where I felt like I understood how to cope with
Loss and
grief and
pain.
loss. You
Yes.
still have to go through it, but it's not as world crushing, I think, as it was when I was younger.
Right. And it's like you learn about yourself and you learn what you should do and what's smart. And
Hmm.
like you also learn how to accept your feelings. And that's what like when I went back and read The Great Gatsby, I go back and look at The Crow. It's like that's the stuff I notice now. Like those little bits of just rage that you
Hmm.
feel like when you lose someone, like like even self-hate. Like obviously I did self-mutilate, but it's like there is that sense of like, I did something wrong. I hate myself, that
Hmm.
sort of thing. As
Oh,
much
the
as you
blame and
lash
the
out at
guilt.
other people.
What could I have done to have, not been in the car driving down that road when the gang was there,
Right. It's like
kind of thing.
stuff that any normal person would hear and say, of course you didn't know. There's nothing to blame, but
But
it's
but there's
in
there's a
here.
difference from hearing it and knowing it to accepting it. I feel
Right.
like you get to a point in your life where you learn to just really accept the fact that you can't change the past. The past has
Right.
happened, and all you can change is your actions right now and plan for what's coming ahead.
We'd like to take a brief moment to thank you for listening to Storyweavers. For the enjoyment of our listeners, we want to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted.
If you would like to support us further, check out our options on Patreon. Plus, subscribing will get you behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, access to Book of the Month polls, and more. We appreciate any and all support.
Now back to the episode. Exactly.
And what a lot of these stories of loss and revenge kind of teach us is that it's okay to be upset and to be angry and to be sad, for as long as you need it to be. But there also gets to a point where it's destructive to live in that moment.
Yes. And that's, to go back to your question, that's definitely like The Crow and other stuff, the difference between me seeing it now and then when I first saw it. Because I don't want
Yeah.
to say like I read it as a shallow thing,
Right.
but
You read it as a story to be entertained.
as a story that was entertaining, and I knew there was more there. But now that I'm older, I see that what that more is, and I can understand it. And I don't know whether I'm happy that I understand it, but it's a necessary evil. And it shows, like, this touches on a broader topic, but like all the people trying to ban books and all the people who are trying to say, no, you can't read that. No, no, no. It's like, that's the kind of importance these stories have. It's like someone who might feel lost can now find the guiding light in something like this. So, yeah.
So, but no, I'm very appreciative of the fact that you recommended this to me, and
I'm glad.
Kind of to give a little glimpse behind the scenes, this kind of two-part idea of us sharing stories that are personal to us definitely came from a little bit of a selfish place of wanting to be able to gab on about things that I like and give you an opportunity to gab on about things you like. And what I was also hoping would happen, and what did happen was it kind of forced me to go into and read something that I probably wouldn't have read before. And it's in more than just a recommendation from a friend, but knowing like, hey, like, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about this and we're going to share it with people. So I actually felt kind of a dedication to have to read it and understand it to some extent so that we could have, some sort of intellectual conversation about it. And I appreciate that a lot. This was a good one to start with.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's stunning. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you enjoyed The Crow. It was a pleasure recommending it. And I'm glad you took a lot out of it, and it was fun to discuss it with you. You understood it, you knew it, and you liked it. So everyone, thank you for tuning in. This is part 1 of 2, as Dean has said. The second part, we'll be talking about the albums that Dean had me listen to in exchange for The Crow. And tune in next time to find out which one I chose. This has been John and Dean, your hosts, and thank you for listening to Storyweavers. Thank you for listening to this episode of Storyweavers. As ever, we're incredibly grateful to all of our listeners and contributors. Come back next week for the next installment of Storyweavers.